Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we'll be focusing on the events of the 7th and 8th centuries. We'll have a brief discussion around the meaning of the word Christendom. Then we'll examine in some detail the rise of Islam. Then look at the spread of the Christian faith into areas of Germany led by Boniface, and conclude with an examination of the Iconoclast Controversy, an issue over whether icons should be venerated. We've now come to the medieval period, otherwise known as the Middle Ages, and this is because the word medieval comes from the two Latin words meaning middle and age. We've noted already that some see the Middle Ages beginning with the fall of Rome and the deposing of the last Western Roman emperor in the year 476. Others see it starting with the ascension of Gregory I to the papal throne in the year 590. There's another word that's been used to define this period of time, and that's the word Christendom. It's usually identified as beginning around the year 600, again with the ascension of Gregory. But what does Christendom mean? In its broad sense, Christendom has been defined as a group of people or nations under a Christian set of morals and values. It refers to the impact of Christianity on the world. It refers not just to a group of people, but also to a territory where Christianity became a vital part of the inhabitants' lives. And to define it further, this narrower sense in which it stands for polity as well as religion, for a nation as well as for a people. In this sense, Christendom is a political term. We've now come to the 7th century. Look at some of the significant events that were taking place during this period of time. Now, we have already mentioned some of these, for example, the Celts and their missionary work, particularly Aidan, who was invited to the kingdom of Northumbria to work among the Anglo-Saxon people there. And we learned how he preached to the people of the region and established the Christian monastery of Lindisfarne. We also learned about Cuthbert, who also preached the Christian message to the people in the remote areas of Northumbria. And then, of course, there was the important Synod of Whitby in 664, when the kingdom of Northumbria decided to accept Roman practices against the Celtic ones, and this decision helped advance Catholicism in the rest of England. We also looked at the Celtic missionary Willibrord, who went to the region of modern-day Netherlands. But there were other significant events that took place in this century. There was the influence of Isidore in Spain, as well as the ongoing strained relationship between the papacy and the Byzantines. And the other significant event that took place in this century was the rise of Islam. One of the important figures in terms of the history of Christianity in England was Theodore of Tarsus. Because he was from Tarsus, he was therefore a Greek. But in the year 668, he was appointed to England by the Pope as the Archbishop of Canterbury. As we've mentioned before, Canterbury was becoming an important centre for the Catholic Church in England. Theodore encouraged the setting up of monastic orders in England. He introduced schools and trained monks, and one of these was Bede, who I've also mentioned before. And it was these schools that saw the beginning of Anglo-Saxon literature. Bede not only wrote his ecclesiastical history of the English people, he was also responsible for one of the earliest translations of parts of the Bible into Old English. It's said that he translated the book of John sometime shortly before his death. Now, it is thought that there were earlier translations of portions of the Bible written in this Old English. For example, Alden, who was both the Bishop of Sherborne and the Abbot of Malmesbury, is thought to have written an Old English translation of the Psalms, possibly toward the end of the 7th century. The Vespasian Psalter was written in Latin, but it had an interlinear gloss written in Old English, and it's dated to around the mid-8th century and is the oldest extant example of an English translation of any portion of the Bible. King Alfred the Great was the ruler of the Anglo-Saxon areas of England in the late 9th century. These areas included English Northumbria in the north and Mercia and Wessex in the west and the south. Amongst Alfred's reforms was his involvement in translating parts of the Bible into Old English. Theodore arrived in 669 and swiftly visited all of the then English parts of Britain and issued instructions on Orthodox or Catholic Christian practices. According to Bede, Theodore of Tarsus was the first archbishop whom the whole church in England agreed to obey. Essentially, this meant that he helped establish Roman uniformity across parts of England, including in the areas that had once adhered to the Celtic form of the Christian faith. Excavations conducted at Anglo-Saxon burial sites have revealed some very interesting changes that took place. Before Theodore arrived, Anglo-Saxon burials were often accompanied by many artefacts related to the person, and sometimes these could be of great monetary value. However, after the time of Theodore, burials became gradually less ostentatious. Eventually, people were only buried in a simple shroud. They were also increasingly more likely to be buried in a churchyard. Now, while these practices might appear to be insignificant, they actually reveal that the Anglo-Saxons were adopting the Christian faith and giving up earlier pagan practices. An important leader in Visigoth Spain was Isidore of Seville. He wrote Etymologia, in which he argued that a sovereign ought to provide for the welfare of the church. And of course, this would be a dangerous precedent in terms of church-state relations. He also said that Jews should not be forcibly converted, but he qualified this by saying that any Jew found to be married to a Christian had to choose between conversion or leave his spouse and children. However, by the 9th Council of Toledo, which was held in 655, the synod declared that all conversos, i.e. converted Jews, had to prove the veracity of their faith. To do so, during Christian festivals, they had to pass by in front of the presence of their bishop. Now, a lack of compliance with this last rule could result in flogging or forced fasting, depending on the age of the offender. Even by the mid-600s, the papacy was still being influenced by the Byzantine emperor. Emperor Constans ordered Pope Martin to be deposed. Martin was arrested. He was taken to Constantinople, where he was put on trial. He was then exiled to the Crimea, where he died of starvation. The 7th century saw the beginning of massive movements of people groups. The first were the Slavs, then came the Vikings, followed by the Magyars, and finally the Muslims. The Slavs from Eastern Europe moved southwards, occupying the Balkans, which separated Rome from the rest of the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century. This was followed by the Vikings from Scandinavia in the 8th and the 9th centuries, and they began making incursions all along the seacoast, initially in northern Europe, attacking places such as Lindisfarne, York, Dublin, and even Paris. Eventually, they made it all the way south into the Mediterranean and attacked Arles in southern France and Pisa in modern-day Italy. They were followed by the Magyar incursions from Eastern Europe into Western Europe in the 10th century. They moved into areas such as Germany, France, and Italy. In the south, Muslim armies had conquered North Africa and parts of Spain, and in the 9th and 10th centuries they took control of Sicily and made incursions into southern Italy, capturing the port city of Bari. They also attacked the islands of Sardinia, Corsica, and made incursions into southern France. However, into the pagan lands of Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and Russia went missionaries such as Methodius and Cyril to the Slavs and Ansgar to the Vikings. But before talking about them, we'll begin by examining the coming of Islam.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allah.
In the Middle East, a new religion was beginning, and this religion was to be a major challenge to the church, and its influence has continued to this day. So it's very relevant to look in some detail at the origins of this movement, its early years, as well as some of its teaching. Muhammad was born around the year 570 in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia today. He was born into a poor family of the ruling Quraysh tribe. And his father died before his birth, and his mother when he was about 6 years of age. And there are some mythical legends about his childhood. His grandfather then died when he was about 8, and so he was brought up by his uncle, Abu Talib. Around the age of 25, he married Khadijah. She was 15 years older than he was, and also wealthy. And as a result, Muhammad became a rich trader. While Khadijah was alive, she remained Muhammad's only wife, and it was only after she died in the year 619 that he married again, and in total he had 8 wives. He had 6 children with Khadijah, although one authority says that it was 7. There were 2 boys and 4 girls. The boys died in infancy, leaving him without an heir. But it was his daughter, Fatima, who would later be the wife of Ali, who would be the 4th Caliph. It was around the year 607 that he began to make retreats into the nearby mountain of Jebel al-Nur, which is just north of Mecca. He claimed that while he was in the mountains, the angel Gabriel appeared to him, and he was given the command to recite the messages he received from the angel. It's important to add that Muhammad, it is said, could neither read nor write. So Muhammad memorized these messages and recited them. And then sometime later, these messages were written down, and this became the Quran. The root word being linked to the Arabic word to recite or to address.
Recite in the name of your Lord, the Creator, who created man from clots of blood. Recite. Your Lord is the most bounteous one, who by the pen has taught mankind many things they do not know. Indeed, man transgresses in thinking himself his own master. For to your Lord shall all things return.
His teaching was similar in parts to Judaism and Christianity, and in the Quran there are many references to Old and New Testament figures, including Jesus. But there are also many differences in detail, which indicates that Muhammad was not very familiar with the Bible. His messages were initially a warning of coming judgment on the people. In particular, there was a speaking out against idolatry and polytheism. But the message soon became, there is only one God, Allah in Arabic, and Muhammad is his prophet. It's thought that Muhammad was probably influenced by what he had heard from Jewish and Christian groups. And we've heard before how there were Nestorian Christian communities in various parts of Arabia, so he may have been in contact with them. What were some of those basic differences or misunderstandings that we see today in the Quran? One was that Mary was thought to be part of the Trinity. Muhammad also claimed that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, and this was a possible influence from Docetic Christian groups. He denied the divinity of Jesus, arguing that Jesus was just another prophet in the tradition of the prophets. These examples show that Muhammad had some understanding of the Bible, but that his understanding was limited. It was his wife, Khadijah, who was the first to accept his message. Then it was slowly received by a few of his close friends. He then began preaching in public and many listened to his message. He condemned the worship of idols that were kept in a shrine called the Kaaba, and eventually a small community of believers gathered together. His first wife then died. Even though Muhammad generally found the Meccans to be unresponsive to his message, it was the people of Medina, which lay to the north of Mecca, that began to accept what Muhammad was saying. Opposition to him in Mecca gradually increased, and they grew more hostile to Muhammad and his followers, and so much so that in the year 622 they had to flee from Mecca, which they did secretly. And this migration is called the Hijrah, meaning migration or flight, and it's the Muslim calendar that begins at this point. So because a large number of his followers were from Medina, it seemed a fertile area to spread his message. So that's where they fled to. Medina was about 350 kilometres to the north. While in Medina, Muhammad grew in influence and acceptance, and he soon ruled the town, and he proved to be an able administrator. And it was at Medina that the first mosque was built, and that Friday was instituted as the Muslim holy day. Just 2 years after arriving in Medina, a force of Meccans numbering about 1,000 men marched against Muhammad and his supporters. Muhammad, with only 300 men, went out to meet them, and an important battle took place at Badr, just south of Medina. This was the first important military victory for Muhammad, and this established him as an important military leader. The following year, as a reprisal, the leaders of Mecca then went and fought against Muhammad's forces at the Battle of Uhud. Here Muhammad was injured in the battle, and though Muhammad's forces lost this battle, Medina was not taken. It's thought that the idea of jihad or holy war probably developed around this time. Muhammad promised his Muslim warriors who died fighting for the faith that they would have immediate entry into paradise. In Medina, he initially had the support of the local Jewish population, but with his claims of new revelations, many of them no longer accepted him. Muhammad then expelled one clan of the Jews and then massacred 600 men of the Jewish clan and enslaved their women and children. However, on the whole, he tended to treat Christian and Jewish groups with respect and gave them some religious freedom, as long as they recognised his rule and paid tribute. However, idolaters were forced to accept his teaching and forced to become Muslims. Muhammad's power and influence around Medina grew, and eventually he became strong enough to attack Mecca itself. And so in the year 630, Muhammad took with him 10,000 men to march against Mecca. There was little resistance from the Meccan troops, and so Mecca came under Muhammad's control. The populace were treated leniently. In fact, it's said that only 4 were killed, and soon became loyal to Muhammad. The Kaaba, which was the centre of idolatry, was cleansed. Its idols were removed, and it became the focus of Muslim worship. Today, it's the location for Muslim pilgrimages, and every Muslim is expected to travel there at least once in their lifetime. Muhammad then returned to Medina to live, and 2 years later he died, but his religion was established and strong enough to continue on without him. And today it's estimated there are approximately 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, which is about 23% of the world's population. Let's just briefly examine some of the beliefs of Islam. And the word Islam, by the way, means submission. The idea behind this is being submissive to Allah. Now, Islamic belief is based on what are called the 5 pillars. And these include the creed. And the creed is there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. Then there's fasting. And this occurs during the month of Ramadan, which is different every year as it follows a lunar cycle. No food or drink is to be consumed from sunrise to sunset. The third is prayers, and prayers were to be said 5 times a day, and there were set patterns or liturgy for prayer. Tithing is number 4, or zakat, and this was where 1/40th of a person's income was to go to the poor, and this was an obligatory payment. And the 5th or the final pillar was the pilgrimage or the Hajj. And as I said before, every Muslim is expected to go to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. While Ramadan is a time of fasting, it's also a time of feasting because at sunset the restrictions were released and so people could enjoy the festivities of good food and drink. In terms of prayer, originally Muslims would face Jerusalem, but after disputes with the Jews, it was changed so that today Muslims face Mecca. And the pilgrimage called the Hajj is an annual event that takes place over a 10-day period. One of the rituals of the Hajj is to walk around the Kaaba 7 times in a counter-clockwise direction. In recent years, sometimes more than 2.5 million pilgrims have travelled from various places around the world to attend. While the Quran is an important source of authority for Muslims, there are in addition 3 other important sources or documents. Collectively, these are known as the Sharia, which means literally the way. The Sharia is made up of the Quran, the Hadith, which is the oral traditions about Muhammad, which were written down later, the Ijma, which are the learned opinions of others, and the Qiyas, which are deductions or precedents. The Quran is made up of 114 chapters, and these are called surahs. Each line is rhymed in the Arabic, but there's no metre or fixed length of each line. There's also no chronological or thematic order of the Quran. Rather, it's ordered from the longest to the shortest surah. Now, Muslims only accept the Quran in Arabic. Translations into other languages, while they may be regarded as being helpful, they are not regarded as authoritative. We'll just look briefly at Muslim teaching. Here is a customary prayer that's used in Islamic religious ceremonies, and it occupies a place in Islam similar to that of the Lord's Prayer in Christianity. In the name of God, the mercy-giving, the merciful. Praise be to God, Lord of the universe, the mercy-giving, the merciful, ruler on the day of repayment. You do we worship, and you do we call on for help. Guide us along the straight road, the road of those whom you have favoured, with whom you are not angry, nor who are lost. In this quote from the Quran, we see attitudes towards Christians and Jews.
Those who believe and those who are Jews, Christians and Sabians, in fact, anyone who believes in God and the last day and acts honourably will receive their earnings from their Lord. No fear will lie upon them, nor need they feel saddened.
However, the Quran was very different when it came to talking about idolaters.
So when the sacred months have passed away, then slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captives and besiege them, and lay in wait for them in every ambush. Then, if they repent and keep up prayer and pay the poor rate, leave their way free to them. Surely Allah is forgiving, merciful.
Islam has been accused of being an aggressive religion. Here the Quran speaks about the Islamic attitude to war. Fight those who fight against you along God's way, yet do not initiate hostilities. God does not love aggressors. Kill them wherever you may catch them and expel them from anywhere they may have expelled you. Sedition is more serious than killing, yet do not fight them at the hallowed mosque unless they fight you there. If they should fight you, then fight them back. Such is the reward for disbelievers. However, if they stop, God will be forgiving, merciful. Fight them until there is no more subversion and all religion belongs to God. If they stop, let there be no more hostility, except toward wrongdoers. By the time of Muhammad's death in the year 632, Islamic rule extended to large areas of Arabia, shown in brown on this map. Authority to lead the Islamic community went to the religious leaders, called the caliphs. Now, under the leadership of the first four caliphs, Islam became a conquering force. After taking the remaining parts of Arabia, Islamic forces moved on and conquered Palestine, parts of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia, as shown here on the map in the colour purple. Following the death of Muhammad, Islam was led by four caliphs. The first was Abu Bakr, who was caliph from the years 623 to 634. It was Abu Bakr who set in motion the task of having the first written text of the Quran. The second caliph was Omar, who was caliph from 634 to 644. During his rule, Islam extended with conquests beyond the frontiers of Arabia, north into Syria and Palestine, west into Egypt and east into Iraq and Iran. Omar was assassinated. The third caliph was Uthman. He was caliph from 644 to 656. Islamic conquests continued eastward and raids westward as far as Tunisia in northern Africa. He was responsible for organising the edition of the Quran, and he too was murdered. The fourth caliph was Ali. Ali was caliph from 656 to 661. He was actually the son of Muhammad's uncle, Abu Talib, therefore Muhammad's cousin, who on his uncle's death Muhammad had actually adopted. Later, Ali married Fatima, who was Muhammad's daughter, and they had two sons, Hassan and Hussein. Ali was also assassinated in the year 661. After Ali, the fourth caliph, was assassinated in 661, his eldest son Hassan became caliph, but this was for only 6 months when he had to abdicate to Muawiyah, who had founded the Umayyad dynasty. In the year 670, Hassan died, leaving his younger brother Hussein as potential heir to the caliphate. When Muawiyah died in 680, the heir to the caliphate was Hussein, who was the son of Ali and Fatima, and also therefore the grandson of Muhammad. However, Muawiyah's son Yazid had been appointed by his father. Hussein refused to accept Yazid's appointment, and in the ensuing conflict, Hussein was killed by forces loyal to Yazid. Divisions in Islam soon arose over the acceptance of these first 4 caliphs. Now, Sunni Muslims accept them, but Shias or Shiites only adhere to the teachings of Muhammad and the religious guidance of his family, i.e. the descendants of Fatima, his daughter, and her husband Ali, the fourth caliph. It was their son Hussein who was killed by the Sunni Umayyads at Karbala, which is in western Iraq. Hussein's death is still commemorated by Shia Muslims today. The division between Sunni and Shia still exists today, with approximately 90% of all Muslims being Sunni and approximately 10% regard themselves as Shia or one of the Shia breakaway groups. Here on this map, the Sunni nations are shown in green and the Shia nations in maroon. The Islamic nation of Iran is Shia, and Iraq also has a large percentage of Shia. Regarding breakaway groups, Oman, pictured in blue, follows another branch of Islam called Ibadi. In addition, there is Baha'i, which is an offshoot from Shia Islam. Baha'i faith has its headquarters today in Haifa, in Israel. There has been an ongoing conflict between the Sunni and Shia groups. Conflict and violence has marred their interaction down through the centuries and continues to the present day. Although it should be added that often politics rather than piety is at the heart of the conflict. The Umayyad period is generally regarded to have been from the years 661 to 750. The Umayyad capital was Damascus, and they were predominantly Sunni Muslims. It was under the leadership of the Umayyads that the Muslim faith spread rapidly through conquest. By the 8th century, they'd conquered Cyprus, Sicily, Afghanistan, parts of northern Africa, Spain, and thus ending the Visigoth kingdom there, parts of India, right until the borders of China. It wasn't until 732 that they were halted by the Franks at the Battle of Tours in modern-day France. The orange part of this map shows the extent of the Umayyad conquests. As mentioned, in 732, its advance into Europe was halted by the Franks under Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, at the Battle of Tours in central France. However, Muslims continued to occupy Spain and began what is known as the Moor rule. Charles Martel himself went on to be king of the Franks, and his grandson would be Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, who'd be ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and we'll get to him a little later. One of the familiar landmarks in Jerusalem today is the Dome of the Rock. This Muslim building was built in the Umayyad period, completed in the year 688. It's held that this was built on the site of the ruined Jewish temple. Generally speaking, under the Umayyads, Jews and Christians were permitted to carry on their beliefs as long as the zakat or tax was paid and they didn't proselytise. The Monophysites of Egypt in particular weren't adverse to having Muslims conquer them, as they had been persecuted by the Byzantine Christians. The Umayyad period was followed by the Abbasid period, and the Abbasids were in power between the years 750 to 945. The capital was Baghdad, and it was predominantly Shiite. It was during the Abbasid period that Islamic civilization was at its height. There was a gradual fragmentation of the Abbasid Empire, and into this vacuum arose a number of other empires. And rather than go into great detail, which can tend to be a bit confusing, we'll just look at a few important historical points. One of the empires that arose was led by the Seljuk Turks. Now they were Sunni, and they originally came from the area of the Aral Sea, which is the lighter shaded area on the map here. As their influence spread westward, they threatened the Byzantine Empire, and as a consequence, the emperor called for Christian help from the west. And this help came in the form of the Crusaders, and we shall look at this a little later. It should be noted that the Seljuks did not conquer Egypt, and there was a succession of Muslim empires that were based there. It was Saladin from Egypt who fought against the Seljuks and took most of the Seljuk land in Syria. Saladin created the Ayyubid dynasty, and Saladin was also significant for defeating the Crusaders and ending their rule in Jerusalem. However, the Turks would re-emerge as a power in the 1500s in the form of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. However, before the Ayyubids, the Fatimid Caliphate ruled Egypt, and they were Shia-based, and they held power from 909 to 1171. It was they who were followed by the Ayyubid dynasty, which was Sunni. For a period, the Fatimids controlled Palestine, and it was during the rule of one of their leaders, al-Hakim, that persecution took place against Christians and Jews. The persecution began around the year 1009, when Caliph Hakim began to destroy Christian places of worship. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site believed to be the burial place of Jesus, was destroyed. Hakim was extremely eccentric, possibly mad. He made Christians and Jews wear a black hat, and also made Christians wear wooden crosses around their necks. Now, these crosses weren't small, they were about 1/2 metre long by 1/2 metre wide. The Jews were ordered to wear a wooden calf around their necks. This was to remind them of the sin of making the golden calf. Now, it's important to realise that Hakim stood in contrast to the other Fatimid leaders who were generally tolerant to Jews and Christians. After Hakim died, pilgrimages to Palestine recommenced, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was repaired by the Christian Byzantine Emperor in 1048. However, the actions of Hakim were remembered by those Christians in Europe, and this laid the animosity that later led to the Crusades. The Ayyubids were followed by the Mamluks. The Mamluks were based in Cairo, in Egypt. They gradually took control of areas of the Levant, which is in modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. The next major Islamic empire was that of the Ottoman Turks. Now, the Ottoman Turks were initially from modern-day Eastern Turkey, and they began to increase in power and geographical extent from the mid-14th century onwards, and they were Sunni. It was the Ottoman Turks that would end the Byzantine Empire in the year 1453 by capturing Constantinople. The empire was at its height under the rule of Suleiman. The Ottoman Empire continued to expand, and it wasn't until the year 1683 that their advance into Europe was halted at the walls of Vienna. We now come to the 8th century and some of the significant events. Early on, the Visigoth kingdom in Spain fell to the Umayyad Muslims. Meanwhile, Boniface began his German mission. Over in the east, there was the Iconoclast Controversy over the issue of whether icons were acceptable or not. In the modern country of France, we had the rise of the Franks or the Carolingians and the important Battle of Tours, where Charles Martel defeated the Moors from Spain. In 756, the Papal States were formed. And to conclude the century, we have the birth of Charlemagne in the year 768 and the 7th Church Council in the year 787. Boniface, also known as Winfrid, was an English Benedictine monk. He was primarily a man of action rather than of literary output. It was he who took the gospel into the Germanic areas of Europe, and he was particularly successful among the people from the region known as Hesse. Boniface had originally trained at the Benedictine monastery at Winchester. He then went to Friesland, where he spent a year with the other British monk and missionary, Willibrord, who had come from Northumbria. Pope Gregory III saw Boniface as a missionary that could counteract the irregularities of the Irish Celtic Christians, so he appointed him as a bishop, and he was sent to the Frankish lands, where he set up churches and convents. He conducted a mission in Saxony and Thuringia, and then in Hesse, which are all regions of modern-day Germany. He helped to establish the monastery at Fulda, and this monastery became a cultural and religious centre for all Germany. The Fulda monastery is shown here in this picture under the numbers 5, 6 and 7. One of the well-known stories of Boniface states how he confronted a tree which was worshipped by the local Saxons as the deity of Thor. According to the story, he took up an axe and he challenged Thor to strike him down if he cut down his so-called holy tree, and then proceeded to cut it down. According to a contemporary biographer, a gust of wind caught the half-cut tree and blew it over, and Boniface then stood on the stump and said to those assembled, "How stands your mighty God? My God is stronger than he." Boniface and his supporters then began schools in connection with the monasteries he had established, and this promoted education in Germany. He was then appointed as the Archbishop of Mainz, which meant that he oversaw the Catholic Church in all of the German regions. So Boniface strengthened the papal authority in many areas across Europe, in particular in Germany and France. He was concerned about the worldliness and the lack of discipline among the clerics. For example, their frequenting of taverns and their drunkenness, and their carrying of arms, their involvement in hunting and their relationships with women. In the year 754, Boniface went back to minister in Friesland and was martyred there. We now come to an issue which was to drive a wedge between the eastern and the western branches of the church. It was called the Iconoclast Controversy. The Iconoclast Controversy began in the year 726, when the Byzantine Emperor Leo III was concerned with the rising power of Islam, and he wondered why God was allowing this to happen. He concluded that the use of images in worship was akin to idolatry. Initially, Leo asked that the images and pictures be placed so high up that people couldn't kiss them, but the Patriarch and other clergy objected. So he eventually banned the use of statues and images of Christ, Mary and the saints, and he ordered that they be destroyed. Some people, in defending icons, actually died trying to protect them. The actions of the emperor particularly incensed the western branch of the church, and so this was another incident that affected the relationship between these two branches. And as we've noted, there was already a growing division between the two prior to the Iconoclast Controversy. In the picture on the left, Emperor Leo, who is seated, debates iconoclasm with his clergy, while the iconoclasts whitewash an image of Christ. Meanwhile, in the right picture, two bishops venerate a sacred image. Now, it was Pope Gregory II who was critical of the emperor's role in church affairs, and he sought to find a political protector in the West, a leader who would follow his orthodox teaching. And eventually a protector arose in the form of Pepin and his son Charlemagne, who was a ruler of the Franks. In the year 754, a synod of Constantinople was held. Emperor Constantine V, who was Leo III's son, called for the synod to be held there. The synod condemned the veneration of icons, arguing that they were contrary to scripture, a pagan practice which led people into temptation. However, there were many clergy in the East who did not agree with this pronouncement. The issue was settled in the year 787 at the 7th Ecumenical Church Council. And this council was held at Nicaea, and it was decided that icons were indeed acceptable. Although in the East, they ceased to have statues in their churches, whereas in the West, the practice continued. However, it should be noted that many Protestant denominations do not accept the 7th Ecumenical Council decisions, but instead prefer the 754 decisions made at the Synod of Constantinople, which of course condemned icons. One of those who had defended the use of icons was John of Damascus. He said they acted as a stimulus to Christian devotion. He also exalted Mary and promoted the concept of her immaculate conception, and this meant that she was born without original sin, he said. He also claimed, but he wasn't the first to do so, of the bodily assumption of Mary into heaven. Now, Catholic and Orthodox teaching are not clear whether this occurred at the end of Mary's life, in other words, after she died, she ascended, or whether she actually didn't physically die and was taken to heaven. While Catholics are divided as to whether Mary was alive or dead, both groups do believe in a bodily assumption of Mary. John of Damascus also offered various proofs for God's existence, and this influenced the later scholastics, such as Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas, who emphasised human reason. We've now come to the end of this video. In our next video, we'll look at the rising power of the Franks and note in particular the influence of Emperor Charlemagne. We'll also look at some mission work. There was Ansgar, who directed mission work to the Vikings in modern-day Denmark and Sweden, and Cyril and his brother Methodius, who were missionaries to the Slavic people of Eastern Europe.